By the time German troops began referring to him as Terrible Terry, they were not repeating an Allied nickname or reacting to propaganda. They were responding to a commander whose methods shattered expectations of how American generals fought wars. Terry Allen did not command from the rear, did not prioritize polished appearances, and did not care whether his superiors approved of his style. What he cared about was relentless pressure. Against an enemy that thrived on predictability and defensive doctrine, Allen offered something different: constant aggression, improvisation, and an almost casual disregard for conventional command etiquette. To German units facing him in North Africa and Italy, his presence signaled chaos, speed, and an opponent who refused to fight on expected terms. Allen's rise was unconventional from the start. A veteran of World War I, he was older than many of his contemporaries and lacked the aristocratic bearing often associated with senior officers. He dressed sloppily, swore freely, and appeared more comfortable among enlisted men than at headquarters briefings. This outward informality masked a deeply serious combat philosophy. Allen believed that hesitation killed, that momentum mattered more than perfect coordination, and that the enemy should never be allowed time to recover. He encouraged initiative at every level, rewarding junior officers and NCOs who acted decisively without waiting for orders. Where other generals emphasized rigid control, Allen fostered controlled disorder. His divisions moved fast, struck unexpectedly, and pressed forward even when conditions were unclear. To German commanders trained to anticipate methodical Allied advances, this was deeply unsettling. Allen's reputation was forged during the North African campaign, where American forces were still learning how to fight a modern mechanized war. While some U.S. units struggled with coordination and leadership, Allen's division attacked with a ferocity that surprised both allies and enemies. He drove his men hard, but he also trusted them. He accepted losses as the price of maintaining pressure, believing that slowing down would cost more lives in the long run. German after-action reports began to note American units that did not behave as expected, units that advanced aggressively, infiltrated positions, and refused to disengage even under heavy fire. Those units were often under Allen's command. What truly distinguished Allen, however, was not just aggression, but unpredictability. German doctrine relied on identifying enemy patterns, predicting movement, and preparing defenses accordingly. Allen disrupted that process. He attacked at odd hours, pushed through terrain considered impassable, and exploited fleeting opportunities without waiting for perfect alignment. His forces appeared where German planners did not expect them, striking flanks and rear areas with alarming frequency. This unpredictability created a psychological effect that went beyond tactical losses. German troops facing Allen's units reported constant tension, never certain where the next blow would fall or how long a position could be held. Yet Allen was not universally admired within the American command structure. His superiors often viewed him as undisciplined, difficult, and resistant to authority. His willingness to tolerate rough behavior among his troops, his disregard for strict uniform standards, and his blunt criticism of higher headquarters made him a problematic figure in a military culture that valued order and appearance. But on the battlefield, results spoke louder than decorum. Allen's units consistently moved faster, fought harder, and broke through defenses that stalled other formations. For the enemy, this effectiveness mattered far more than Allen's reputation among his peers. By the time Allied forces moved into Italy, German troops had begun to recognize a pattern. Certain American units did not pause, did not probe cautiously, and did not retreat easily. They advanced with a relentlessness that suggested their commander was less interested in preserving neat battle lines than in overwhelming resistance through sheer pressure. That commander was Terry Allen. His nickname, Terrible Terry, reflected not cruelty, but the fear generated by his refusal to ease off once contact was made. Against him, German units learned that holding ground required constant readiness, and that any lapse could be exploited immediately. This was only the beginning of Allen's wartime legacy. His methods would shape some of the hardest fighting of the Allied advance and influence how American commanders understood aggressive warfare. but they would also place him on a collision course with the very institution he served. Allen's story is not just one of battlefield success. It is the story of a commander whose relentless style made him feared by the enemy and controversial among his own side, setting the stage for both remarkable victories and inevitable conflict within the Allied command. The true test of Terry Allen's command style came in North Africa, where American forces faced experienced German and Italian units for the first time. This was not a forgiving environment. The terrain was harsh, supply lines were stretched, and the enemy was well-trained, confident, and accustomed to exploiting hesitation. Early American failures elsewhere had reinforced German assumptions that U.S. troops lacked combat toughness and operational discipline. Allen's units would challenge those assumptions head-on. Where other American formations paused to regroup after setbacks, Allen pushed forward, often before the enemy expected renewed contact. This refusal to slow the tempo disrupted German planning cycles and denied them the initiative they relied on. Allen understood that German doctrine depended on predictability. German commanders preferred to fix an opponent in place, analyze movement patterns, and respond with carefully prepared counterattacks. Allen refused to play that game. His division advanced aggressively, probing continuously, even when intelligence was incomplete. Rather than waiting for ideal conditions, he exploited momentum, believing that speed created its own form of protection. German defenders soon discovered that withdrawing to reorganize often resulted in immediate pursuit. Holding ground invited pressure. Either choice carried risk. That uncertainty wore down enemy morale far faster than traditional, methodical advances. German after-action reports from North Africa began to reflect this discomfort. They described American units that attacked repeatedly, shifted axes of advance without warning, and continued operations despite casualties that might have caused other formations to pause. These reports did not portray Allen's troops as reckless. They portrayed them as relentless. German officers noted that American forces under Allen seemed less concerned with perfect alignment and more focused on maintaining pressure at all costs. This made defensive planning difficult and recovery periods rare. Even when German units achieved temporary success, they could not count on time to consolidate before the next assault. Allen's leadership style reinforced this effect. He delegated authority aggressively, trusting subordinate commanders to exploit opportunities without waiting for approval. This led to uneven execution at times, but it also meant that German forces faced a decentralized opponent capable of rapid adaptation. Small unit leaders pushed forward independently, exploiting gaps and pressing advantages wherever they appeared. For German commanders trained to expect centralized control, this behavior appeared chaotic, but it was chaos with direction. Allen's intent was always clear: keep moving, keep attacking, and never give the enemy breathing room. This approach came at a cost. Casualties were higher than some American commanders were comfortable with, and Allen made no effort to disguise that reality. He believed that fighting cautiously prolonged battles and increased losses overall. To him, decisiveness saved lives in the long run. That belief put him at odds with more conservative senior officers who worried about sustainability and discipline. But in North Africa, results mattered. Allen's units advanced where others stalled, forcing German forces to respond rather than dictate the fight. That reversal of roles was deeply unsettling for an enemy accustomed to controlling engagements. The psychological impact on German troops should not be underestimated. Facing Allen's division meant constant readiness. Night offered no guarantee of rest. Withdrawal did not ensure safety. Defensive positions were tested repeatedly, often from unexpected directions. German soldiers reported exhaustion, not just from combat, but from the inability to predict when or where the next attack would occur. Over time, this pressure eroded confidence. Positions that might have been held longer against a slower opponent were abandoned sooner, not because they were untenable, but because defenders expected another immediate assault. By the end of the North African campaign, Allen's reputation was firmly established on both sides of the front. Among German troops, he was recognized as a commander whose units did not fight by the book. Among American leadership, he was increasingly viewed as a problem. His results were undeniable, but his methods challenged institutional norms. He was difficult to control, resistant to micromanagement, and indifferent to appearances. That tension would only grow as the war moved into more complex theaters. North Africa proved one thing beyond doubt. Terry Allen's relentlessness worked against German doctrine. It forced the enemy into a reactive posture and denied them the predictability they needed to fight effectively. It also set the stage for future success and future conflict. As Allied operations expanded into Italy and beyond, Allen would continue to apply pressure in ways that frightened the enemy and unsettled his own superiors. The question was no longer whether his methods were effective. It was whether the U.S. Army was willing to tolerate a general who refused to fight any other way. When Allied forces shifted their focus to Italy, the character of the war changed dramatically. The open spaces of North Africa gave way to mountainous terrain, narrow valleys, fortified villages, and defensive positions layered in depth. It was a theater that favored the defender, and German forces exploited it ruthlessly. Many Allied commanders responded with caution, aware that frontal assaults against prepared positions could be devastatingly costly. Terry Allen did not abandon caution, but he refused to let it slow the tempo of operations. In Italy, his approach became even more pronounced. He pressed his units forward relentlessly, probing German defenses day and night, forcing constant engagement rather than allowing the enemy to settle into stable defensive rhythms. German troops in Italy quickly learned that American units under Allen did not behave like the rest. Positions that might have been tested once and left alone were hit repeatedly from different directions. Withdrawal routes were threatened almost immediately. Allen encouraged infiltration, flanking movements, and aggressive reconnaissance, often blurring the line between probing and full assault. German commanders accustomed to methodical Allied attacks now faced an opponent who seemed willing to accept uncertainty in exchange for momentum. This was deeply unsettling in terrain where predictability was normally a defender's greatest asset. As fighting intensified, German reports increasingly referenced American units that applied pressure without pause. These were not reckless attacks, but continuous ones. Allen believed that the enemy's greatest vulnerability lay in exhaustion and loss of initiative. By keeping German troops constantly engaged, he reduced their ability to rotate units, repair defenses, or reorganize after setbacks. Even limited gains were exploited immediately, forcing German commanders to commit reserves earlier than planned. Over time, this constant strain eroded the defensive coherence that Italian terrain was supposed to provide. Allen's leadership style amplified this effect. He spent time near the front, observing conditions firsthand and communicating directly with subordinate commanders. Orders were concise and intent-focused rather than detailed and restrictive. Junior leaders understood that hesitation was discouraged and initiative rewarded. This created a command environment where opportunities were seized quickly, sometimes imperfectly, but rarely ignored. German troops facing Allen's units described an enemy that was always pressing, always probing, and never content to hold ground passively. The nickname Terrible Terry began to circulate more widely during this period. It reflected the enemy's perception of Allen as a commander who did not give them time to breathe. His units did not pause simply because a line had been reached. They attacked again from another angle at another hour with little warning. This unpredictability increased fear out of proportion to numerical strength. German defenders might withstand one assault, only to find themselves under renewed pressure before they could recover. Over time, this created the sense that Allen's forces were everywhere at once, an illusion born of constant forward motion. Yet the very traits that made Allen effective against the enemy increasingly alarmed his own superiors. Italy was a politically sensitive theater, and higher headquarters worried about attrition, logistics, and coordination across multinational forces. Allen's tolerance for disorder, his acceptance of higher casualty rates, and his blunt disregard for administrative norms made him appear reckless in the eyes of senior planners. To them, he was a general who delivered results at the expense of control. To Allen, control was meaningless if it slowed the fight. This growing tension did not diminish Allen's effectiveness in Italy, but it did shape how he was perceived within the U.S. Army. He was respected by his troops, feared by the enemy, and increasingly scrutinized by higher command. German troops facing him saw only the pressure and unpredictability. American leaders saw a commander who challenged institutional expectations. Both views were accurate, and together they defined Allen's wartime experience. By the end of the Italian campaign, Terry Allen had become a known quantity on both sides of the front. German units recognized the signs of his involvement and prepared for relentless contact. American headquarters recognized his results but questioned his long-term suitability within a command system that prized discipline and uniformity. This contradiction would soon come to a head. Allen's methods had proven their value, but they had also set him on a collision course with the very army he served. By late 1943, Terry Allen's reputation had become paradoxical. On the battlefield, his units consistently delivered results. German defenses were broken, positions were overrun, and momentum was maintained in environments where many commanders struggled to advance at all. Among German troops, Allen's methods had earned a reputation for relentless pressure and unpredictability. Yet within the U.S. Army's senior leadership, those same qualities were increasingly viewed as liabilities rather than strengths. Allen's refusal to conform to institutional expectations placed him on a collision course with a command culture that valued control, appearance, and long-term sustainability as much as battlefield success. Allen's leadership style clashed directly with the evolving priorities of the U.S. Army as it expanded into a global force. Senior commanders were no longer managing isolated campaigns but coordinating massive multinational operations across multiple theaters. This required standardization, discipline, and predictability. Allen offered none of these. He tolerated loose discipline if it improved combat effectiveness, allowed his officers wide latitude in execution, and showed little interest in administrative polish. Reports from higher headquarters increasingly criticized his division for excessive casualties, uneven unit discipline, and insufficient adherence to procedure. Allen did not deny these criticisms. He simply rejected the premise that such concerns should outweigh combat momentum. This attitude alarmed senior leaders. To them, Allen represented a dangerous precedent. If every division commander operated with the same autonomy and disregard for centralized control, coordination would collapse. The fact that Allen's methods worked against German forces did not resolve this concern. In fact, it made it more urgent. His success threatened to legitimize an approach that ran counter to the Army's institutional identity. As a result, Allen's actions were scrutinized more closely than those of more conventional commanders. Every casualty report, every disciplinary issue, every deviation from doctrine was noted and accumulated. The breaking point came not because Allen failed, but because he succeeded too visibly while refusing to adapt. In 1944, despite his combat record, he was relieved of divisional command. Official explanations cited concerns over discipline and casualty rates, but the underlying issue was deeper. Allen could not be easily managed. He resisted micromanagement, spoke bluntly to superiors, and showed little interest in moderating his approach to satisfy bureaucratic expectations. For an army transitioning from improvisation to institutional maturity, that made him expendable. The decision shocked many of his subordinates and puzzled observers who measured leadership primarily by results. German troops who had faced Allen would have found the move incomprehensible. From their perspective, he was one of the few American generals whose presence altered the character of the fight. His removal did not reflect battlefield failure. It reflected institutional discomfort. The U.S. Army chose predictability over unpredictability, control over aggression. In doing so, it sidelined a commander whose style had proven uniquely effective against the enemy. Allen's removal did not erase his impact. The lessons of his command continued to circulate informally among officers who had served under him. His emphasis on initiative, speed, and pressure influenced how junior leaders approached combat, even as official doctrine emphasized coordination and restraint. German forces, for their part, never experienced relief in the way American headquarters expected. The aggressive ethos Allen fostered did not disappear with him. It had already been absorbed by the units he trained and led. This episode illustrates a central tension in modern warfare. The qualities that make a commander effective against the enemy are not always the qualities an institution finds comfortable. Allen forced the U.S. Army to confront that contradiction. His success exposed the limits of bureaucratic tolerance for deviation, even in wartime. For German troops, Allen remained a feared adversary. For American leadership, he became a problem to be solved. By the time the war moved toward its final phase, Allen's direct influence on operations had diminished, but his legacy had not. His career raised an uncomfortable question. Should armies prioritize commanders who fit the system or those who break it to win? In Terry Allen's case, the answer chosen by the institution came at the cost of sidelining one of its most relentless battlefield leaders. The enemy noticed his absence. The Army justified it as necessity. When the war in Europe ended, Terry Allen did not emerge as one of the celebrated faces of American victory. He did not command armies during the final drive into Germany, nor did he occupy the spotlight reserved for generals who embodied institutional success. Instead, his legacy followed a quieter, more complicated path. Within the U.S. Army, Allen became a cautionary figure, remembered as a commander whose battlefield effectiveness came at the cost of conformity. Among German troops who had faced his units, however, his reputation endured in a far more direct way. To them, Allen was not an administrative problem or a doctrinal challenge. He was the American general whose presence changed the nature of combat, turning defensive warfare into a relentless struggle for survival. What made Allen distinctive was not innovation in technology or grand strategy, but the way he applied pressure. German units trained to absorb attacks, reorganize, and counterstrike found themselves denied that rhythm. Allen's insistence on constant engagement disrupted defensive planning and exhausted manpower long before material losses became decisive. This psychological dimension mattered as much as tactical outcomes. Fear, in this context, did not stem from brutality or excess, but from unpredictability and persistence. German troops learned that facing Allen meant never being certain when the next attack would come, or how long a position could truly be held. Ironically, the qualities that made Allen effective against the enemy were those the U.S. Army ultimately rejected. As the American military matured into a global institution, it favored commanders who could operate within a tightly coordinated system, manage logistics across continents, and present a disciplined image of control. Allen represented a different model, one rooted in decentralization, initiative, and personal trust between commander and soldier. That model proved dangerous to an enemy trained to expect caution, but uncomfortable to an organization striving for standardization. His removal was not a repudiation of his results, but a reaffirmation of institutional priorities. Yet Allen's influence did not vanish with his command. Officers who served under him carried his philosophy forward, applying lessons about momentum, initiative, and aggressive leadership in later operations. His approach became part of the Army's informal memory, shaping combat behavior even as official doctrine emphasized restraint. In this sense, Allen's legacy survived not in manuals, but in attitudes. German forces had responded to that attitude with fear because it denied them control over the tempo of battle. American leadership, paradoxically, feared it for much the same reason. History often rewards commanders who fit their era's preferred narrative. Terry Allen did not. He was too rough, too blunt, too indifferent to appearances. But he understood something fundamental about combat, that uncertainty imposed on the enemy can be more decisive than perfect planning. His career illustrates the tension between effectiveness in war and comfort in command. The Germans experienced only the first. The U.S. Army wrestled with the second. In the end, Terry Allen's story challenges easy conclusions. He was not a flawless hero, nor a reckless outlier. He was a commander whose relentless style exploited German weaknesses while exposing American institutional limits. The fact that German troops feared him is not a myth or exaggeration. It is a reflection of how deeply his approach unsettled an enemy accustomed to order and predictability. That fear was earned not through spectacle, but through pressure applied again and again until resistance fractured. Allen may not have shaped the final maps of Europe, but he shaped the experience of those who fought him. For German soldiers, his name became associated with unrelenting contact and denied respite. For the American Army, he became a reminder that victory can come from methods that do not fit neatly within established systems. That dual legacy explains why Terry Allen remains one of the most compelling and controversial American generals of the Second World War.